Greetings, students. This is your Professor George Maniotis back again for segment 2 of chapter 16. What I'd like to talk about here, and I'm going to put this into a different mode here. I'm sorry. Okay, now we're back. All right, now I'd like to talk to you about the Native American Wars. The struggle between the indigenous people, what we would call Native Americans or Indians, versus the white men during the period from about 1850 to 1880. There was a number of armed uprisings, reprisals on white settlers that were moving into the area that the Native Americans were involved with. So this has not been a necessarily a friendly process here. If anything, this has become quite contentious, quite troublesome. So what we're seeing here is the fact that during this period, the Sioux that lived in Minnesota, starting in the 1860s, were shuffled off and exploited by white Bureau of Indian Affairs officers, led by Little Crow, their chief. They killed more than 700 whites before they were subsequently subdued. And in retaliation for this, 38 Native American Sioux were hung, and the tribe was sent out to the Dakotas. And they remain out there today in western North Dakota, South Dakota, in some rather tough areas. I mean, right in the Black Hills, it's a tough area to live. So they were dispossessed off of good lands onto smaller lands. Now, in eastern Colorado, the Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians came in conflict with white miners who were beginning to settle in that region. And these Native Americans began to attack stagecoach lines and settlements in an attempt to regain their territory. In response to this, white Native settlers started to raise territorial militias, small armed bands that were condoned by the state governments. In other words, allowed by the state governments. So one band of Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians under the leadership of a leader called Black Kettle camped near Fort Lyon on Sand Creek in November of 1864. Now, for the most part, the number of natives in that were women, children, and others who were seeking protection before the army bands began to go out hunting up the, warriors that were revolting. Well, what ended up happening was the U.S. Cavalry under a officer by the name of Colonel Shivington led this volunteer militia, many of which were lit up on alcohol, drunk, and they attacked the camp, massacring 133 people, 105 of which were women and children. Black Creek escaped the Sand Creek massacre, but 4 years later, in 1868, he and the Cheyenne supporters went to war with the whites. And these native fighters were caught on the Washita River near the Texas border by Colonel George Custer. Now, George Custer had been a general in the Civil War, but after the Civil War, because the armies were reduced in size, many of these officers, their ranks were lowered, etc. Not because they weren't doing good business, weren't good leaders. They were just smaller army. You don't need all these generals. And Custer ended up killing Black Creek at Washita. And this began to lead to Custer's fame as a great Indian fighter. Now, he had excelled during the Civil War as a cavalry officer for the Union cause. And ironically, Custer is a Michigan native from around the Kalamazoo, Battle Creek area. So, after the Civil War, federal troops began to step up in their battles against Native Americans on several fronts. One of the most serious fights was in Montana, where the Army attempted to build the Bozeman Trail to connect Fort Laramie to the new mining centers. Western Sioux Indians resented this intrusion in the heart of their buffalo range, and one of their great chiefs, Red Cloud, harried the troops and their construction parties so the road couldn't be used. It wasn't just the military that harassed the tribes. White vigilantes, usually settlers and others, engaged in unofficial attacks of violence that were known as Indian hunting campaigns. Just like they would go out like deer hunting. You know, a series of people would go out today deer hunting, seasons open type of thing. Well, yeah, they'd had the similar type of campaigns, Indian hunting, hunt up Native Americans, exterminate them because they're a nuisance. And this open aggression towards Native Americans resulted in scores of Native American losses. 5,000 plus people in California alone were killed at the hands of these vigilantes. And it's estimated that the indigenous population of California went from 150,000 before the Civil War to less than 30,000 in 1870. Well, that's an incredible extermination. In 1867, a number of treaties were negotiated to try to get a ceasefire going in these conflicts. But oftentimes these peace treaties were shattered. As more whites began to settle, mostly miners, in the Dakota territories, resistance began to increase. The Sioux rose up in 1875 and left their reservation. White officials tried to get them to return, but bands of warriors gathered in Montana and united under two great Native American leaders, one being Crazy Horse and the other one being Sitting Bull. 3 American Army cavalry columns were set out to round them up and force them back on the reservation. With the colonel of the 7th Cavalry, George Custer, in charge, a battle occurred at a place called Little Bighorn in southern Montana, where they encountered a large Sioux army of 2,500, surrounded Custer, and ended up killing him and all of his soldiers at this battle. In 1877, one of the most difficult and dramatic situations with Native Americans happened. This with the Nez Perce in Idaho. The Nez Perce was a relatively small, peaceful tribe that tried to live in Oregon without being molested by the whites. They never had signed a treaty with the United States, didn't feel they needed to, And under pressure from white settlers, the U.S. government now forced them to move upon a reservation. There was no expectation that the Nez Perce were going to resist, and they began their journey to the reservation. But when several members of their tribe, drunk and angry, killed 4 white settlers, all bets were off. Now, this made them a target for the armies, the U.S. Army. Their chief Joseph, persuaded his followers to flee. In other words, get away from the troops. And the American troops pursued them and attacked them, only to be driven off in battle at Whitebird Canyon. After that, the Nez Perce scattered in several directions, Joseph leading a group north of 200 warriors and 350 women and children, hoped to reach Canada so they could escape from the oppression of the U.S. Army. They were pursued by soldiers, and they covered an amazing 1,321 miles in 75 days, repelling or invading the army. They were just caught short of the Canadian border. Some escaped and slipped across the border, but Joseph and his followers, weary and discouraged, finally gave up. Joseph stated, "I'm tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun stands now, I will fight no more forever." And this was the relegation of the proud Native Americans, being subjected to the whims and whimsies of the U.S. Army. The last Native society to organize resistance were the Chiricahua Apache, led by Magnus Coloradus and Cochise. Now, Magnus was murdered during the Civil War by white soldiers who tricked him into surrendering. In 1872, Cochise agreed to peace in exchange for a reservation that included some of the nation's traditional lands. But Cochise died in 1874, and his successor, Geronimo, fought for more than a decade, establishing bases in the mountains of Arizona and Mexico, leading warriors into raids on white outposts. With each raid, the number of warring Apache dwindled. As some warriors died, others drifted away to the reservation. In 1886, Geronimo's band only consisted of 30 people, including men and women and children, while his pursuers numbered greater than 10,000. And he recognized these odds and surrendered. Now, the Apache Wars were the most violent of conflicts, but whites committed the most flagrant atrocities. Violence didn't end with the Apache War. There was another encounter in 1890 that was a result of a religious revival among the Sioux, a revival itself that symbolized these catastrophic effects of white assaults. As other Native people had done in trying times in the past, many Native people turned to a prophet who preached renewal through religious revival. The name of this prophet was called Wovoka, a Paiute who inspired a spiritual awakening in Nevada, and quickly this spread out into the plains. Well, Volko predicted the imminent coming of a Messiah. In other words, like a Jesus-type figure, who would lead followers in an emotional dance, Indian dance, called the ghost dance, which inspired ecstatic and mystical visions, including images of retreat of the white people from the plains and the restoration of the buffalo herds. Indian agents, white Indian agents, seeing these dances, began to become concerned. And then in 1890, the white cavalry tried to round up a group of 350 cold and starving Sioux at Wounded Knee. Fighting broke out, 40 soldiers were killed, and up to 200 native people died. It was unclear who shot the first shot, but the battle became a one-sided massacre as white soldiers turned their new machine guns onto the Sioux. And this pretty much marked the breaking of the Native American nations and the proud Native Americans being relegated fully to reservations throughout the country. Now, the Dawes Act, what was it? What did it promote? Well, several years before Wounded Knee, the federal government moved to destroy the tribal structure that was the cornerstone of Native culture. Congress abolished a practice which white Native nations owned reservation lands. The Dawes Severalty Act provided for the gradual elimination of most tribal ownership of land and the allotment of tracts to individual owners. So, in other words, the tribe didn't own the land, the individual would own the land. And land was distributed in the following fashion: 160 acres to a head of the family, 80 acres to a single adult or orphan, 40 acres to each dependent child. Adult owners were given U.S. citizenship, but unlike other citizens, they could not gain full title to their property for 25 years. Now, this was done to attempt to keep them from selling their land to speculators. The idea was to try to assimilate Native Americans into the dominant culture, white culture. However, the people running these programs were very inept and very corrupt, and there were repeated issues with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which had been set up to administer this approach. Many of these Bureau of Indian Affairs officials took away the children from their native families and sent them away to boarding schools run by whites and sometimes by various denominations of Christian churches, Catholics, Presbyterians, others. Now imagine you're living on a reservation, you've been given land, but suddenly your children are seized and sent off to boarding school. Can't imagine that being a good situation at all. Finally, we're going to start to see what had started out as a very promising enterprise where white settlers were going to lay claim to the plains and to, turn the plains into this Garden of Eden type approach. Well, initially, there was some good gains on farms in the plains. But for one reason or other, things began to turn against these farmers. One of the things that started to change was the fact that cattle ranching was no longer popular. It wasn't a can't miss situation, driving cows thousands of miles to railheads led to too much expense and too much loss of animals. And with the development of railroads throughout the West, it wasn't essential now to drive cows several hundred miles or 1,000 miles to a railroad crossing. The other thing is cheap rail rates brought more and more farmers to the West, increasing competition. And this created more land under cultivation. It was estimated that 180 million acres of land was under cultivation during the late 1870s. And the connection between railroads and cultivation promoted this sort of market mentality where farmers could rely on shipping their products to larger markets using the trains. What also contributed to this was the climate. For many years, the climate was quite moderate on the plains, and rainfall was above average. But as time would go on, by the 1880s, rainfall became scarce, and this area was not as conducive to the raising of crops. Now, what were they raising out here? Well, wheat was the primary thing. So as more wheat is being harvested, the price of wheat begins to tumble, and it becomes very, very difficult to make money. They weren't paying for increased wheat costs. Now, the other thing is the necessity to have to dig deeper and deeper wells to cultivate the land. And that meant that they had to resort to something called dry land farming, which is a system that tends to conserve moisture in the soil by covering it with a dust blanket or planting drought-resistant crops. However, this did not succeed. And over time, many people who had migrated to the plains began to find themselves underwater, and they began to migrate back. In other words, instead of moving further west, they abandoned the plains and began to move east, thus creating ghost towns out on the prairie. Places that formerly were occupied, now depopulated to the point where there was essentially nobody there. And this was not only indicative of the plains of the United States, because by the 19th century, the late 19th century, agricultural practices and with better farm machinery and seeds drove the price of food down and increased the amount of available food. And this created a buyer's market. No longer was the United States one of the sole producers of wheat, but other countries, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, also became major players. And this resulted in wheat prices tumbling worldwide. Now, the other thing we're going to see is what we call farmers' grievances. In other words, what was causing these farmers to be upset? Well, they knew that something was wrong. The idea of using credit. They also felt trapped by the costs imposed by the railroads on their products. And they also felt that there was a conspiracy. And oftentimes people, when things are going wrong, they believe it's more than just their individual thing. They felt that there was a conspiracy that was attempting to keep them down. Now, the other thing is we're going to start to see reasons for discontent with farmers. You can't make a living, you're isolated, it's stressful. Kids can't really get a good education because there's very few opportunities for schooling. You don't have good hospitals or doctors nearby. There's not enough things to do. Well, that is going to make you very discontent. And this started to, cause many people that were living in this isolation on the plains to yearn to move somewhere else. Now, the other thing is, with this sense of isolation and obsolescence, which means we don't no longer need your services, this created a malaise among the farmers. Some of the literature of the period begins to talk about this idea that, the farmer's spirit had become really a nightmare instead of a dream. So American agriculture is going through a very difficult time during this period. Well, we're going to continue on with this and see how this impacts currency and economic issues and other things. So, stand by.